The government of China marched down in 1839 to the harbour at Canton and destroyed over 1,000 tons of British property, dumping it into the sea. The contraband was not weapons, it was not gold, it was opium. And the reason Britain was flooding China with a devastating drug was almost absurdly simple. The British were addicted to something else, something they could only buy from China, and they were running out of money to pay for it. That thing was tea. Within months, the two greatest empires on earth were at war, over a cup of leaves and hot water. That sounds insane, but the fact that nations bankrupted themselves, fought wars, committed history's greatest act of corporate espionage, and enslaved millions, all over a dried leaf you can buy today for pennies, tells you something. Tea was never just a drink. It never was. So how did the leaves of a single wild shrub become the most consumed beverage on the planet after water, drunk by billions of people every single day? How did it topple dynasties, redraw the map of Asia, and help spark the birth of the United States? To understand that, you have to go back almost 5,000 years to the misty mountains of southwestern China, and a story that is almost certainly a myth. According to Chinese legend, in 2737 BC, the Emperor Shen Nung, a divine farmer and herbalist, was boiling water in his garden when a few leaves drifted down from an overhanging branch into his pot. He drank the accidental brew, found it refreshing and restorative, and tea was born. It is a lovely story. It is also almost certainly not true. Shen Nung may never have existed as a real person at all, but the legend points at something real. The tea plant, Camellia sinensis, the single species that gives us all true tea, green, black, white, oolong, every kind, did originate in the Yunnan region of southwestern China, and people there were chewing and brewing its leaves thousands of years before anyone in the West knew the plant existed. For centuries, tea was medicine, not pleasure. Ancient Chinese texts prescribed it for everything from fatigue to poor digestion to failing eyesight. People boiled chunks of pressed tea brick with salt, ginger, and even onion into a kind of bitter soup. If you ordered that today, you would spit it out. Tea had to be transformed before it could conquer the world. That transformation happened during the Tang dynasty, which ruled China from the 600s to the 900s, and it centered on one man. His name was Lu Yu, an orphan raised by Buddhist monks who became utterly obsessed with tea. Not just drinking it, studying it. He wandered China for years, visiting tea regions, testing water sources, and documenting every detail of how tea should be grown, processed, and brewed. Around 760 AD, he wrote it all down in a book called the Cha Jing, or the Classic of Tea, the first book in human history devoted entirely to the drink. It covered everything: how to grow the plant, how to process the leaves, which water made the best brew, even the ideal shape of the cup. Lu Yu turned tea from a folk remedy into an art form, with rules, aesthetics, and a philosophy behind it. He is still honoured in China as the sage of tea, and in his own lifetime he grew so famous that merchants reportedly kept little figurines of him to bless their tea shops. The Tang Emperor was so taken with the fashion that tea became a taxable commodity, and the government realised that if everyone was drinking this stuff, it could make a fortune regulating it. That pattern, tea as a source of enormous state revenue, would repeat for more than 1,000 years. In empire after empire, tea was becoming money. From China, tea spread outward along the trade routes, and crucially, along the path of Buddhism. Monks carried it to Korea and Japan, where it was prized for keeping them awake during long meditation, and where it eventually grew into the extraordinary refinement of the Japanese tea ceremony. Meanwhile, back in China, the way of drinking tea kept evolving. By the Ming dynasty, in the 1300s, people had shifted to steeping loose leaves in hot water, which is essentially how most of the world drinks tea today. By this point, tea was flowing along the Silk Road into Central Asia and the Middle East, traded alongside silk and spices. But Europe for a long time had no idea it existed. The most consequential drink in the coming history of the West had not yet touched a single European lip. That changed in the 1600s. Portuguese and Dutch traders operating out of ports like Macau encountered tea and began shipping small, wildly expensive quantities back to Europe, where it was treated as an exotic medicine for the very rich, sold by the ounce and locked away like a precious spice. Then came a royal wedding that changed everything. In 1662, King Charles II of England married a Portuguese princess named Catherine of Braganza, and Catherine had grown up drinking tea and was utterly devoted to it. Now, tea had already trickled into England through Dutch traders a few years earlier, so the popular story that Catherine single-handedly introduced it is not quite right. What she really did was make it fashionable. As queen, she made tea the chic drink of the royal court, sipped from delicate imported Chinese porcelain, and where the aristocracy led, everyone else scrambled to follow. Within a couple of generations, tea went from an exotic curiosity to the national obsession of England. Tea houses spread across London, and a company that had been trading in spices and cloth spotted the opportunity of a lifetime. The British East India Company realised that tea was about to become the most profitable product on earth, and that is where this story turns very dark. If you are finding this video interesting, hit subscribe. We dig into the hidden histories behind drinks every week, and you will not want to miss what is coming next. The British East India Company had a problem, and it was a problem of money. China was the only source of tea in the world, and Britain was buying staggering amounts of it. But the Chinese emperor felt China had no need for British goods in return. He wanted payment in one thing only: silver. So Britain was hemorrhaging silver to China year after year, and the imbalance was becoming a national crisis. So the British found something China did want, whether it wanted it or not: opium. Operating through the East India Company, British traders grew opium in India and smuggled enormous quantities into China, deliberately and cynically creating a nation of addicts to reverse the flow of silver back into British pockets. By the 1830s, millions of Chinese people were addicted, and the damage to Chinese society was catastrophic. When the Chinese government finally cracked down and destroyed over 20,000 chests of British opium in 1839, Britain used it as the excuse for war. The First Opium War from 1839 to 1842 ended in a crushing defeat for China, which was forced to open its ports and hand over Hong Kong. A second Opium War followed a few years later, with the same humiliating result. For China, these wars began what its own historians would later call the Century of Humiliation, a long, painful unravelling of the world's oldest continuous civilization at the hands of foreign powers. And the wound at the centre of it was a nation of newly created drug addicts, poisoned so that Britain could keep its teacups full. All of it, the drugs, the addiction, the gunships, the seized territory, was driven in large part by Britain's desperation to keep the tea flowing without going broke. A cup of tea helped start two wars and bring the oldest empire on earth to its knees. But even as it fought China, Britain was hatching a second scheme, and it may be the greatest act of corporate espionage in history. Britain wanted to break China's monopoly on tea completely by learning to grow it themselves in their colony of India. The problem was that China guarded the secrets of tea production ferociously, and foreigners were forbidden from the tea regions. So in 1848, the East India Company hired a Scottish botanist named Robert Fortune and sent him to steal it all. Fortune shaved his head, put on Chinese clothing and a false braided ponytail, and travelled deep into the forbidden tea-growing interior, disguised as a merchant from a distant province, risking his life. Discovery could have meant death. Over the next few years, he learned the closely guarded secrets of how tea was grown, processed, and manufactured. And in the process, he uncovered a fact that stunned Europe. Green tea and black tea were not two different plants at all. As many had believed, but the very same leaf, simply processed differently. He collected tens of thousands of tea plants and seeds, and using ingenious sealed glass cases that kept plants alive on long voyages, smuggled around 20,000 of them out to the Himalayan foothills of India. He even recruited experienced Chinese tea workers to come and run the new plantations. It was industrial theft on a national scale, one of the boldest acts of corporate espionage ever attempted. And though many of his stolen Chinese plants actually died, and India's own native tea variety in Assam turned out to matter more, Fortune's espionage helped shatter China's 1,000-year monopoly for good. Within a few decades, British India was outproducing China itself. But that new empire of tea was built on human misery. The British cleared vast stretches of India and the island of Ceylon, today Sri Lanka, and covered them in tea plantations. In the northeastern Indian region of Assam, they had discovered a native variety of the tea plant growing wild, hardy and strong. And it was this Indian tea, more than Fortune smuggled Chinese plants, that truly powered the British tea empire. But growing tea on that scale demanded armies of workers to pick it, leaf by leaf. In Ceylon, the British brought in huge numbers of Tamil labourers from southern India. Across the plantations, workers toiled brutal hours for almost nothing, trapped by debt and distance in conditions that were often closer to bondage than free employment. Whole families, including young children, spent their entire lives plucking tea leaf by leaf for wages that barely kept them alive. While the profits sailed off to London, entire communities were uprooted and transplanted to serve the tea industry, and the social scars from that era still run deep in those regions today. The cheap, comforting cup of tea that warmed the British Empire was made possible by the backbreaking, poorly paid labour of colonised people thousands of miles away. That was the true price of the drink, and it was never printed on the box. While Britain was reshaping Asia to feed its tea habit, tea was playing a very different role on the other side of the Atlantic. By the 1770s, the American colonists were drinking enormous quantities of tea, and Britain taxed it. In particular, the Tea Act of 1773 handed the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America, complete with a tax the colonists had no say in approving. To them, it was tyranny in a teacup. On the night of December the 16th, 1773, a group of colonists, some disguised as Native American warriors, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water, roughly 90,000 pounds of it, worth a small fortune in today's money. It was a stunning act of defiance, and Britain responded with harsh punishments that only enraged the colonies further, pushing them toward open rebellion. The Boston Tea Party was one of the sparks that lit the American Revolution. In a very real sense, tea helped create the United States, and it left a lasting mark on the American palate. After the Revolution, drinking tea felt unpatriotic, tied to the British crown the colonists had just fought off. So Americans turned to coffee instead as a kind of political statement. That is a big part of why, to this day, the United States is a coffee-drinking island in a world of tea drinkers. A protest over tea quietly rewired the tastes of an entire nation. Back in Britain and its empire, TA only tightened its grip, sinking down through every layer of society. The tradition of afternoon tea is usually credited to Anna, the Duchess of Bedford, around the 1840s, who supposedly grew hungry in the long gap between lunch and a fashionably late dinner, and began taking tea with a light snack in the afternoon. She invited friends, the habit spread through high society, and a ritual was born, complete with delicate china, tiered trays of cakes and sandwiches, and its own elaborate etiquette. But tea was not just for duchesses, it became the fuel of the working class. Factory workers during the Industrial Revolution drank strong, sweet, milky tea to get through their grueling shifts. It was warm, cheap, mildly stimulating, and the boiling water needed to make it killed the bacteria in otherwise unsafe drinking water. Some historians argue that tea, by helping keep workers hydrated and disease-free, quietly helped make the Industrial Revolution itself possible. From the grandest drawing room to the poorest kitchen, an entire nation now ran on tea. That thirst turned tea shipping into a global spectacle. In the 1860s, sleek, beautiful sailing ships called tea clippers raced each other from China to London, because the first ship to land the new season's tea could sell it at a premium. In the most famous of these, the Great Tea Race of 1866, a fleet of clippers left the Chinese coast within a day of each other and sailed roughly 14,000 miles around the tip of Africa. After 3 months and half a world of ocean, the two leading ships arrived in London on the very same tide, just minutes apart. Crowds gathered at the docks, newspapers covered the finish like a championship, and bets were placed. These clippers were the fastest sailing ships ever built, marvels of speed with names like Ariel and Taping and Fiery Cross, and their captains drove their crews mercilessly, because being first to market could mean a fortune. Tea had become sport, spectacle, and national drama. That is how much this drink mattered. Then the 20th century arrived, and tea, so ancient and ceremonial, started reinventing itself for a faster, busier world, though not always in the ways the legends claim. Take iced tea. The popular story is that it was invented at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, when a vendor, unable to sell hot tea in a heatwave, dumped ice into it. It is a great tale, but it is mostly a myth. Cold, sweet tea had been served across the American South for decades before 1904. The fair did not invent iced tea, it just made it famous nationwide. The tea bag has a similar story. Credit usually goes to a New York merchant named Thomas Sullivan around 1908, who sent tea samples in little silk pouches that customers dunked whole into hot water by mistake. But the real inventors were two women from Milwaukee, who had patented a tea holding bag years earlier in 1901. As so often in history, the person who got the credit was not the person who did it first. However it happened, the tea bag made brewing effortless, and it conquered the world's kitchens, even as tea purists in China and Japan looked on in horror. And as tea spread across the globe, it did something remarkable. Nearly every culture made it their own. In India, the country the British had turned into a tea giant, tea became chai, brewed thick with milk, sugar and warming spices like cardamom and ginger, sold on every street corner. In Morocco, sweet mint tea became the very heart of hospitality, poured from a height into small glasses, refusing a cup considered an insult. In Turkey, tea became so central to daily life that Turks now drink more of it per person than anyone else on earth, brewed strong in a stacked double kettle and served in little tulip-shaped glasses as a constant gesture of welcome. In Tibet and the high Himalayas, tea was churned with yak butter and salt into a rich, savoury drink that fuels life at brutal altitude. In Russia, tea brewed in an ornate urn called a samovar became a symbol of the whole culture. In Britain, it stayed the milky, sugary heart of daily life. One plant, Camellia sinensis, had become thousands of different rituals, each one feeling ancient and native to the place that adopted it. Tea had stopped being Chinese or British. It had become human. And there is one more reason tea wrapped itself so tightly around the human race, what it quietly does to the body and mind. Tea carries caffeine, enough to sharpen and energize, but it also contains a compound called L-theanine, which softens caffeine's jittery edge into a calmer, steadier kind of alertness. For meditating monks, for factory workers, for scholars and soldiers, tea delivered focus without the jangle, wakefulness without the crash. For centuries, cultures also treated it as medicine, and modern science does find real antioxidants in it, though the wilder health claims that tea cures this or prevents that tend to race far ahead of the actual evidence, exactly as they did with coffee and wine. What is beyond doubt is subtler and more powerful. Tea makes people feel good, gently, reliably, several times a day. That, more than any medicine, is why the habit stuck to our species and never let go. Today, tea is the second most consumed drink on the planet, after only water, sipped by well over 2 billion people every single day. China is once again the world's largest producer, growing something like 40% of all the tea on Earth, followed by India and Kenya, and the global tea trade is worth many billions of dollars a year. And here is a fact that catches most people off guard. The country that drinks the most tea per person is not China or Britain or Japan. It is Turkey, where tea is a near constant ritual of hospitality, brewed strong and offered in small glasses from morning to night. Every cup of it, from a delicate hand-picked Darjeeling to a mass-produced bag dunked in a hurry, comes from the leaves of that same single species. The only real difference is how the leaves are processed after picking. Green tea is barely oxidized, black tea fully oxidized, oolong somewhere in between, white tea the least handled of all. One plant, thousands of variations, nearly 5,000 years of history, from a legend about an emperor's garden to a monk's book, to opium wars and stolen seeds and colonial plantations, to a bag dunked in a mug at your kitchen counter. So the next time you wrap your hands around a warm cup of tea, that ordinary, comforting, everyday thing, remember what it actually carries. It carries a Tang dynasty scholar debating the perfect water, and Buddhist monks brewing it to stay awake through the night. It carries the silver that drained out of Britain, the opium that flooded into China, and the gunships that followed. It carries a Scottish spy in disguise with his pockets full of stolen seeds, the uprooted labourers who picked it for almost nothing, and the colonists who dumped it into Boston Harbour to help found a nation. The drink that empires taxed, that spies stole, that started wars and toppled revolutions, is sitting in your cup right now, steaming and quiet and utterly ordinary, waiting to be noticed. Tea was never just a drink. It never was, and it never will be. If this dark story surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind drinks. We have got a lot more coming.